This is for the avid readers and lifelong learners like myself. If you're like me, often a basic summary or video on something just isn't enough and you want something more dense that you can really sink your teeth into and do some deep learning. So in this video, I'm pulling out 10 of my personal favourite and most read books related to death and dying. And of course, all references and details will be in the description. Please remember to like and subscribe, and now let's talk death book recommendations. Before we start, because I know someone will mention it, obviously I haven't read every book on the subject, so if you think I've left out a good one, please let everyone know in the comments. Also, I'm purposely not including any religion-based books because I don't want to, and frankly, I haven't read them. But if that angle is your cup of tea, I know there are many religious-based books around death and dying out there, and they're very easy to find. Now, onwards. The classic. The American Way of Death by Jessica Mitford was originally published in 1963. It is an expose of abuses in the funeral home industry in the United States, in which Mitford harshly criticizes the industry for using unscrupulous business practices to take advantage of grieving families. Keep in mind, the 60s was a very different time than what it is now. The book then and now is both loved and hated, which is why it is an interesting read. Now, this book is obviously out of print, but an updated version was printed in 1998. Now, this means you're going to need to be searching your secondhand bookstores for it, which is where I found my copy. And heads up, Mitford also wrote a book called The American Way of Birth, which has an identical cover except for the one word, so don't do what I did and grab one thinking that there was the same book but more recently published. The often misquoted classic. On Death and Dying by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was originally published in 1969. She is credited with outlining the 5 stages of grief. The problem is that she was never actually talking about grief associated with losing a loved one. She was talking about the process a terminally ill patient goes through when coming to terms with their diagnosis. I've referenced her in many of our videos on grief and the terminally ill on this channel. Her book is filled with interviews to help illustrate the stages. It has been republished many times, and there is a companion called Questions and Answers on Death and Dying, which answers questions Kubler-Ross was commonly asked on her book tour. These are also most likely to be another secondhand bookstore find, but I've also seen many copies in various public libraries. The textbook. Feeling studious? Then this one's for you. The Handbook of Thanatology is the official textbook for most accredited thanatology programs around the world. It states that it is the essential body of knowledge for the study of death, dying, and bereavement. So it does like to toot its own horn a little bit. If you have read many uni textbooks, you will know that they can be a bit dry and annoyingly written. This one does have a few of those issues as it is academic writing, but they have done their best to make it read fluidly and not like a research paper. It does look into many topics, but still with a good amount of substance on each topic. This one will probably have to be found online. The Archaeological Perspective. If archaeology is of interest to you, then you will probably enjoy this book, The Archaeology of Death and Burial by Mike Parker Peterson. Now, you may expect this book to talk about how various cultures practice burial and death rituals, and there is that, but only to show examples of theoretical points. Mostly, it is about the issues archaeologists face when examining burial sites, such as prescribing modern notions of death upon the excavation evidence, amongst other things. It also very starkly points out that archaeology is driven by what can be found, and since many cultures cremated their dead, there is a tendency to forget them. Now, I've referenced this book in both of our death debate videos about digging up the dead and keeping them in museums, so go check those out. It is an incredibly interesting read. It is academically written, but not in an irritating, I'm going to put a reference note at the end of every damn sentence kind of way. There are a couple of pictures and graphs to illustrate some points, but certainly not enough if you rely on them to make sense of what you're reading. This will probably need to be another online purchase. Dark tourism. If you remember our video on dark tourism a while ago, then you'll remember this book. It is called The Atlas of Dark Tourism by Peter Hollines and is only recently published in 2021. It takes you through over 100 dark tourism destinations around the world, giving excellent descriptions and rating them by how dark they are and how easily accessible they are. The reason I like this book is the author's commitment to ethical dark tourism. Again, see our other video for more on that. As this is a new book, you can likely find it at your local bookstore, and I highly encourage you to do so, and is where I found my copy. But I've also seen it in many local libraries as well. The must read for Australians. On this channel, we aim to bring people out of death denial and anxiety and back to death acceptance, where we were just over 100 years ago. Now, our channel is full of videos on how we got to this point of death is unnatural and I don't want to talk about it. But if you want one book that explains it all, it is Patricia Jalland's Australian Ways of Death, A Social and Cultural History. It explains how death was treated in 1840 and how it all changed at the development of World War I. Now, I would show you my copy, but silly me loaned it out and I haven't seen it since. And because of that, I can tell you just how hard it is to track down a copy of this book. It was only released once in limited stock in 2002. It is in many local Aussie libraries, usually separated from the general section and held in the Australian reference section, which you can't loan out. Nevertheless, if you can manage to get your hands on a copy, it is a brilliant read. A good all-rounder. Sally Kant's book, Conversations About Death, is kind of like a For Dummies guide to death. And what I mean by that is, while yes, it is quite a chunky book, don't let that scare you, as it is broken down into many dot points, bold highlighting, and is broken down into small, digestible chunks while still maintaining substance. I really do love a good For Dummies guide. Its cover says that it is a practical guide to talking about end-of-life care and dying, which it does very well, but it talks about much more than that. It talks about your legal rights, about how to plan a funeral, how to have difficult death-related conversations. It is an Australian-based book, i.e. all the legal and regulation stuff is from an Australian point of view, so keep that in mind before buying. I got my copy from a local bookstore, but that was back in 2015, so maybe try your local library or second-hand store. The Anthropological Perspective. I have been looking for years for a book that goes in depth into the death practices of at least most cultures of the world. Now, when I say that out loud, it does sound a little like finding a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Nonetheless, I have bought and read many books that look at various cultures on death rituals, and unfortunately was sadly disappointed. However, this is the best one I have found so far, and it is called Death Across Cultures, Death and Dying in Non-Western Cultures. Now, it only goes into 22 different cultures, but it does those 22 well. It is an academically written book, but it is a relatively easy read if you're an avid reader, and I got my copy online. Funeral industry debate. The funeral industry has its lovers and haters, and some of those haters like to point out some very valid points, which pisses off the funeral industry. Case in point, our video on Caitlin Doherty and the US funeral industry, and just remembering that research makes me so stressed. Well, Robert Larkins, an Australian barrister, has written a book entitled Funeral Rights, What the Australian Death Care Industry Doesn't Want You to Know. Now, if you were hoping for some questionable, overboard, out to be as awful as possible journalism, then I'm afraid you're going to be sorely disappointed, because the Australian funeral industry isn't actually that bad. So why am I recommending this book then? Because it is a very good book, particularly for those who don't understand business or law or common sense. And that is why the title is written that way, to bring in those kind of people who crave seeing the worst. This book does not set out to be some kind of thriller. It calmly and simply explains how the funeral industry works, along with other death-related topics that everyday people need to know. Now, this book was published in 2007, so some of the laws it references have changed by now, so keep that in mind. But the publishing date also means that it is very difficult to track this book down, and I found my copy at a second-hand bookstore. Indigenous Australians. I have been looking for a book about death practices in our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities for ages. And recently I stumbled across this title, Mortality, Mourning and Mortuary Practices in Indigenous Australia. It is another strongly academically written book, but an avid reader shouldn't have much of a problem getting through it. Is it a complete look at the topic? Of course not. With around 500 different communities with different ways of doing things, you couldn't put them all in one book. But it does go into great detail of 15 different communities around Australia. And there's a lot of research and substance in this book, and I got my copy online. My favourite death book. This one's my favourite book, death-related or otherwise. It's titled Death in the Victorian Family by Patricia Jalland, the same person who wrote one of our earlier mentioned books. The Victorians have a lot to teach us about how we deal with death and dying, things that we forgot many generations ago. It looks in depth about how death and dying were viewed back then and how grief and mourning were handled and expressed. If you read this book and then read her other book, The Australian Ways of Death, you will get a very clear picture on what death positivity used to look like, how we ended up in this death-phobic society, and more importantly, how we can go back to being death acceptant and treating death as the natural thing that it is. It is academically written, and I got my copy online. If you are a history buff and want an in-depth look at people's day-to-day lives rather than the kings and queens and big events, then you will enjoy this book, I promise. So what do you think? Have you read any of these and what did you think about them? Do you know any other great death-related books? Let everyone know in the comments. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Now, go talk death.